Not like God is some second-rate father, some deadbeat that just cannot look after his responsibility. No, God had wonderfully looked after them. He had made them tremendous promises, and it's as though God took their rejection of him personally. Our sin, God takes as a personal offence and a personal affront to his holiness. It's not just breaking his law, it is defying his will. Turn again to the book of Numbers. We'll be looking a little at Numbers 14 as our message unfolds. Let me ask you, when was the last time that you went wandering? You went wandering. Wandering has a bit of a negative feel to the word. We talk about wandering around a shopping centre. And there's a certain safety to wandering around a shopping centre because you can get recovered. You might remember where you parked the car, always someone to ask. It's one thing to wander around a shopping centre. I suppose some are, some of the larger centres, other side of Melbourne, can be easier to get lost in. It's one thing to wander around a shopping centre. You can enjoy that or be frustrated by that. Well, what about wandering outside on a trail? And you start out and you might have a map, your phone might be working, and the trail is well marked, except when you really need it to be well marked. I've noticed that Murphy's Law comes into operation. When you really need to know where to turn, there's no markers. They don't exist. And so we associate wandering with being lost. And it can be very scary for some. Wandering away in severe cold or heat can be a fatal exercise, to wander. Well, the book of Numbers is about wandering. In fact, the Hebrew word for we translate Numbers is actually in the wilderness. In the wilderness. And what makes the book of Numbers interesting is that you have God's people wandering around a pretty rugged place for 40 years, not because they were lost, but because God would not let them go into the promised land. That must have made the wandering all the more frustrating and all the more difficult. This book covers only 40 years, one generation. And in fact, the book itself doesn't give us a lot of information about all that went on in those 40 years. You sort of have key events that come up within those 40 years and then virtually silence. The book of Numbers begins out in the wilderness and it ends in the same place. 36 chapters of wandering. It's been said that the question that we need to ask ourselves as we look at the book of Numbers this year is this simple question: will I trust God or not? This book in the Old Testament, this one of 5 books of Moses, gives us the consequences for those who would not trust in God. In Genesis, God chooses Abraham, gives him a great promise: from you are going to come a great nation, and I'm going to put you in a wonderful place. In Exodus, that nation really comes together under Moses. It's a large group of people. In Leviticus, we have the laws of worship for this nation that is going to emerge. And then in Numbers, you have a movement towards the actual possession of the land. They're supposed to get into the land, but they don't. They don't get there. The movement is hindered. And so that this 4th book of Moses relates to this period where things just kind of stop. They stop. and not much progress is made. Numbers begins with people getting ready to go into the promised land, and it ends with a new generation right on the border to that promised land. When Numbers begins, as we're going to see next week, we'll look at Numbers 1. There is a numbering of the tribes of Israel. There are over 600,000 men fit for military service, and when you start to extrapolate about who's married and the elder men and the younger men and how many children the families have, you get to at least 2 million people. You're getting to a large number of people that are going to be wandering for a long time in a very difficult place. It's been said that Numbers is the story of a long discipline, of God's long disciplining hand. The idea of them being in the promised land just sort of stays put for 40 years. So what's the storyline of Numbers? How does it unfold? Well, we have Israel preparing to leave Mount Sinai on the road to the promised land after they receive the law of God. And if Israel had been able to travel right into the promised land, it would have only taken a few weeks. Now, granted, having to walk for a few weeks doesn't sound very attractive, but there were longer journeys in Bible times. This is one of the shorter journeys you could take. So technically, this could have been over within a few weeks or month. It wasn't meant to be a protracted, agonizing, endless journey into God's promised land. And so they proceed toward the border of the promised land to a place called Kadesh Barnea. We'll learn more about that place later. And you know the story of the 12 spies from each tribe, going in for the 40 days and spying out the land, and it's tremendous land. It's tremendous land. Incredible opportunity. It was a tremendous place with tremendous inhabitants. They said they were giants. It was amazing, it was incredible, but also very intimidating and very, very fearful. And the majority, 10 out of 12, bring back a negative report. Now there's two lonesome voices, Caleb and Joshua, who do see the potential of going, and they are aware of God's promises. And so there's two lone voices among the 12. And of course, pessimism won out. The majority were able to convince the people that this was not viable. In a sense, they were right. For them to go in their own strength was not viable. And yet Caleb and Joshua knew that God was strong. God was strong. And because the people accepted the majority report, the Lord had a very devastating judgment for them. We read about that in Numbers 14, and we'll be there very shortly. And so for nearly 40 years, they make this generation of those 20 years and up, wander around the wilderness until that entire generation had died. Someone called that period the crucible of God. God wasn't just punishing those who refused to believe in him. He was giving his future people a very stunning historical lesson. The nation of Israel in the future were to remember God's wonderful victory through the Exodus, but also God's chastening hand in the book of Numbers. God was teaching his disobedient people a lesson, a permanent one, but he was also teaching us and every generation that has read the book of Numbers. It's been said that at the end of Numbers, Israel are not out of the pit geographically. They're not farther forward, but they are a sadder and they are a wiser people. They learnt a thing or two. And even the generation that would enter the promised land, they would make it. Those under the age of 20. They would live with a 40-year lesson of what the Lord had done to their parents and grandparents because they would not obey and trust in the Lord. One writer has perceptively said that Numbers is a book that need not have been. That need not have been. But for the unbelief of the 10 and then the unbelieving nation, but for the unbelief, this book would not have needed to have been written. And so in between the endless wandering, the book of Numbers have these really key events like the rebellion of the sons of Korah in chapter 16. You have the aftermath of the rebellion in 17 to 19. You have the prophet Balaam, this intriguing prophet that is able to corrupt God's people indirectly from Numbers 22 through to 25. It's staggering to think of all of these people with the livestock and their possessions. It would take a certain amount of organisation to keep people occupied and to keep people moving and knowing when to stay and to go for 40 whole years. They're arranged by tribes with the tabernacle at the centre. They had a fixed marching and camping order. Each tribe knew when they were to leave and when to march and where to set up camp when the march had ended. The tribe of Levi would camp nearest the tabernacle and the other tribes would camp around the tabernacle like 4 points of the compass. The tabernacle was their unifying physical identifier. This signified God's presence, even there in the wilderness, which reminds us that even when we have our wilderness times, God is there. God doesn't abandon us, even during those wilderness times. And so Numbers is a book of people going full circle. They simply come back to virtually where they started 40 years later. Sometimes I use the expression, you feel like you're going, it's either one step back, 2 steps forward, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The children of Israel went many steps forward, many steps back, so to speak. That's what happens in this book. But what about Numbers as literature? What kind of book is it? Well, actually, it has lots to it. It's not just about numbers. It's not just about a census that happens at the beginning and end of the book where all of the tribes are counted. There are well-known stories in Sunday school. The kids are going to learn about the talking donkey, and the bronze serpent in the wilderness. These are things that happen in the book of Numbers. After the tragedy of the rebellion by the sons of Korah, it's followed without any sort of comment or commentary by ritual recipes for the food offerings. There are laws, there are psalms, there is prophecy, all mixed together. So there is a lot to the book of Numbers. There's variety there. And of course, whenever we read those lists of names and when you read them, we're not going to get all the pronunciations correct. Just impossible. It's the effort we made reading that counts, doesn't it? In those sort of chapters. That God saw fit to preserve a record of history. These were real events. These just weren't fables. These were things that actually really happened. Now, just for a few moments, I want to just work through a little bit of Numbers 14 to get a sense of what God is is doing and how he is acting. You would have felt the divine frustration in verse 27. How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who complain against me? I've heard the complaints which the children of Israel make against me. And I think what really aggravated the situation was how well God had looked after his people up to this point. God had done some amazing things. And it's not like God is some sort of miserable taskmaster, right? It's not like a handful of people get out of Egypt, yeah? God delivered the nation through plague after plague after plague, and he provides for them in the wilderness. God did an amazing job, so to speak, of looking after his people. It's not like God is some second-rate father, some deadbeat that just cannot look after his responsibility. No, God had wonderfully looked after them. He had made them tremendous promises, and it's as though God took their rejection of him personally. Our sin, God takes as a personal offence and a personal affront to his holiness. It's not just breaking his law, it is defying his will. It is us defying God himself. And God gives them an oath. He gives them an oath. As I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. And then he talks about in verse 29 and verse 32, their carcasses. I mean, that's how you talk about animals. Now, the Old Testament talks about the bones of some of the patriarchs, their bones, not their carcasses. As though they're just dead animals, like they're roadkill. God refers to them as roadkill. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above, if ever there was a good time to be a teenager, it was then. If ever you could just thank the Lord, I'm 19 and under, yeah? You would have breathed one big sigh of relief, but you would have had some older brothers and sisters that get caught up in this. And certainly there may have been some innocents caught up in all of this. But God drew a line and said, okay, 20 years old and up, you want the wilderness? You don't want the promised land? Have the wilderness. This is the place you want to stay in? Then you can have the wilderness. Except for, verse 30, except for. You know what the Bible has from cover to cover? God has his exceptions. God has his exceptions. God has men and women that stand out because they don't follow the crowd. And here you have two men who did not follow the complaining, fearful crowd. And I trust that God can strengthen us to be exceptions to a world and a culture, and sometimes a professing church that has a very small view of God. A God that's powerless. A God that can't intervene, or if he wants to, he just doesn't have the power to. Except for Caleb and Joshua, these two men shine. Think of the countless Jewish and Christian boys who were named Caleb and Joshua. Think about how many were given that name, one of those names, by their parents. Why? Because these two men shone. They shone in the Old Testament. They were the great exception. You see, it's possible just for one or two. It's possible for one or two people to make a great difference in their circumstances. Caleb and Joshua prove that. They prove it. They're going to be the exceptions. And and Caleb and Joshua, decades later, they walk into the promised land. Though they were delayed, they would suffer too, somewhat. They would wait 40 years, but they'd get there. God would have his seal and blessing upon them, and they would enjoy deferred blessings. Christians, we have deferred blessings for us. There are eternal blessings, and we've got to wait for them. Got to be patient. Got to hold on. There were deferred blessings for them. And look at verse 31. He says, but your little ones, he says, whom you said would be victims. Yeah? Oh, if we try and go in the promised land, then we're just going to endanger all of our little ones. No, we want to be responsible parents. We want to protect the little ones. God says, well, hold on a second. The ones you thought you were going to protect by keeping them out, I'm going to bring them in. And they're going to be safe with me as adults. The ones you thought you'd pious, you didn't trust me with the little ones. You didn't think I could protect your little ones. I can look after them, and I'm going to preserve them, and they're going to walk through the promised land one day as fully grown adults. And look at verse 33. Your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years. And bear the brunt of your infidelity. That's a hard verse because, we like it when people just bear their own sin only. Yeah? Okay, God punishes someone for their sin and everyone else, right? Everyone else gets left alone. Well, life's not that simple, is it? It's not that simple. We live in families and communities and this sort of thing, and so individual actions always impact, for good or ill, those around us. And so there would be those that would bear the sin of others, so to speak. They would take the consequences that principally fell on those over them. 1 year for 1 day, verse 34. You're there for 40 days. You're going to bear this for 40 years. And God says, you'll know my rejection. Now, these are hard verses. They're hard verses, but we cannot ignore these verses. They have a role to play in our own growth as believers. That there is a divine chastening that occurs. And I know sometimes it's for a very short period of time. Could be longer. We don't know. But we know from Hebrews 12 that when God chastens us, he actually chastens in love, not hatred. God chastens in love and not in hatred. We need to say that about God. Even in the chastening, he shows love to us. And then look at verse 35 of Numbers 14. I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do this to all this evil congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall be consumed, and there they shall die. Now, I want to balance this out a little bit. The unbelief of God's people, so to speak, did not mean that didn't mean that Israel would never go into the promised land. They were going there. God promised that to Abraham. But it did mean that generation missed out. That's what it meant. God was going to fulfill his word that he made to Abraham repeatedly, the patriarchs, but there was a generation who would miss out. And so we should never twist the fact that God is in control and God fulfills his promises as some sort of immunity for us to do whatever we please. Because we miss out when we sin. We miss out when we reject God. God's going to achieve his purposes in the world. But we're going to miss out on some things. And just like little children who don't want to miss out on things, right? Little kids don't want to miss out on good things. So God's children shouldn't want to miss out on God's good things and blessings. We shouldn't want to. We should want to receive his blessings. Well, what about numbers in the New Testament? It's referred to quite a few times directly and indirectly. Remember when Jesus speaks to Nicodemus at night and he compares himself to Moses lifting up the bronze serpent and Jesus himself being lifted up on the cross. Jesus said, I'm like that bronze serpent that God made. These serpents that had bitten and harmed people, if they would look to the bronze serpent, they would live. They'd live. If you will look to Jesus Christ today and receive him as Lord and Saviour, you can live. Just like the children of Israel would live. Though poisoned, they could look to the serpent and they could live. If you look to Jesus Christ, turn from your sin and receive him as Saviour, you can live forever with God. Paul gives many warnings against idolatry. In 1 Corinthians 10, 3 of his 4 illustrations come from the book of Numbers. It's an important book. Because as believers today, we are to live by faith. By faith. The generation that perished in the wilderness lived by sight. They lived by sight. And they perished. Those who live by faith live. And they enjoy God's promises. Hebrews 10, let me read it to you, 38 and 39. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God. How displeased was God when his people wouldn't live by faith? They languished for a generation. That's how much he cares about this. And so Numbers, the book of Numbers, should make us ask the question this year, will I, but also will we? Because as a church, we go through many of the same things. And we decide certain things, and we pray about certain things, and God leads us as one in different ways. Will we trust God? Will we trust God? Because as intimidating as the giants are, sure beats the wilderness. Sure beats wandering. Sure beats languishing. Sure beats God calling your dead body a carcass. Surely we have a warning here that when God calls us to trust him and respond to him faithfully, much is at stake.